There's a car that should have been one of the greatest ever made in Britain. It had the looks, it had the concept, it had the timing, and it had the backing of one of the most ambitious automotive projects of the 1960s. Men saw it at motor shows and felt something they hadn't felt in years: genuine desire, not just admiration. Desire, the kind that makes you walk around it twice, run your hand along the rear quarter panel, and think, one day, that's mine. The Triumph Stag, a two-door, 2+2 Grand Tourer with a removable hardtop, a throaty V8 engine, and lines drawn by a man who understood beauty the way a sculptor understands marble. It was Britain's answer to the Mercedes SL, Britain's answer to the Italian open-top machines that were making men across Europe feel something behind the wheel. And then it destroyed itself, slowly, publicly, in front of everyone who had believed in it. This is not a story about a bad car. That's the part that makes it genuinely painful. The Stag was not a bad car. It was a brilliant idea, sabotaged by decisions made in boardrooms, not garages, by men protecting budgets, not building legacies. And by the time anyone with real authority admitted what had gone wrong, the damage was done not just to one model, but to an entire industry's reputation. If you're over 50, you remember this era. You remember what it felt like to believe that Britain could build something world-class, something that would make Stuttgart and Milan sit up and take notice. The Stag was supposed to be that thing. And what happened to it is a lesson that goes well beyond cars. It's about what happens when ambition runs headfirst into institutional cowardice. Pay attention, because this story gets heavier as it goes. The Stag was born from a sketch. In 1965, a Triumph saloon, a standard Herald convertible, was sent to Turin, to the studio of Giovanni Michelotti. He was the Italian designer who had already shaped several Triumph models, and Triumph trusted him the way you trust a craftsman who has never let you down. Michelotti took that base car and reimagined it completely. What came back to Coventry turned heads in the factory. Engineers stopped working. Men who had spent their entire careers around metal and oil just stood there, looking. The proportions were nearly perfect. Long bonnet, short rear deck, a distinctive T-bar roll hoop, a structural arch that split the open roof and gave the car a silhouette unlike anything else on British roads. It wasn't trying to copy the Italians. It wasn't trying to be German. It was its own thing, distinctly British in character, but with a sophistication that the domestic market had rarely produced. Triumph's management saw it and understood immediately this was something. This could compete internationally. This could take the fight to Mercedes, to Porsche, to anyone who thought Britain couldn't play at that level. The only question now was what to put under the bonnet, and that question, that single, seemingly straightforward engineering decision, would become the fault line that cracked everything. Here is where the story gets complicated, and where it stops being just about cars. By the late 1960s, Triumph was operating under the British Leyland Motor Corporation, a vast, politically charged conglomerate that had been assembled from dozens of British marques: Austin, Morris, Rover, Jaguar, and more. The logic was consolidation, pool resources, compete globally, build something big enough to hold its ground against Ford, General Motors, and the German manufacturers who were beginning to dominate the market. The reality was chaos. Internal politics between the legacy brands were vicious. Budgets were fought over. Engineering decisions became territorial. And when it came time to choose an engine for the Stag, what should have been a straightforward technical conversation became something far more corrosive. Here is what almost nobody talks about. There was a ready-made, proven, high-quality V8 already inside the British Leyland family, the Rover V8. Originally developed by Buick in America, purchased by Rover in 1965, and refined into one of the most dependable engines the British motor industry had ever worked with. Light, powerful, smooth. It was, and there is no diplomatic way to say this, exactly what the Stag needed. Triumph's engineers knew it. Some of them pushed for it. The Rover V8 was right there. It fit the bill technically, it had a track record, and it would have given the Stag a drivetrain worthy of its bodywork. British Leyland said no. The reasons were never stated with full transparency, but the picture that emerges from the historical record is one of inter-brand rivalry. Rover did not want Triumph using their engine. Triumph did not want to be seen borrowing from Rover, and British Leyland management, rather than making the commercially obvious decision, allowed the internal politics to win. They told Triumph to develop their own V8. So Triumph did. They took two of their existing four-cylinder engines, joined them together to create a V8 configuration, and this became the Stag's powerplant. On paper, the numbers looked acceptable. 1971 cubic centimeters, 145 brake horsepower. Enough to give the car real performance for its day. But paper and reality are two very different things. The engine ran hot, dangerously, persistently, problematically hot. The cooling system was inadequate for what the engine demanded. Cylinder head gaskets failed. Timing chains, which on the Stag required specialist knowledge to replace correctly, would stretch and snap at intervals that no owner should ever have had to accept. Thermostat housings cracked. Coolant mixed with oil. And on a warm summer's day, on a motorway, doing exactly what the car was built to do, the Stag would let you down. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a few isolated cases. This was a pattern, documented, repeated, and known. And the timing of what was known and by whom, and when, is the part of this story that veers from disappointment into something approaching a scandal. But before we get there, and we will get there, understand what was already at stake. The Stag launched in 1971 with a retail price of £2,900. In today's terms, that's the equivalent of roughly £35,000. These were not impulse purchases. These were men making real financial commitments, handing over serious money, trusting a British manufacturer to deliver. That trust was about to be tested in ways nobody had been warned about. Let's talk about what it was actually like to own one. Because that's where the story stops being a business case study and becomes something personal. The early owners, and there are documented accounts from enthusiast archives and period motoring press, described a honeymoon phase that was genuinely extraordinary. The Stag looked sensational. It attracted attention wherever it went. The driving position was excellent. The T-bar roof could be removed and stowed. With the top down on a dry British afternoon, it delivered exactly the feeling it had promised. Men who drove it in those first months understood immediately why they had bought it. And then something went wrong, maybe at 8,000 miles, maybe at 12,000, maybe on a holiday run down to the coast. The temperature gauge crept, then climbed, then the car needed to stop. And the dealer, who himself often had limited diagnostic experience with these specific failure modes, would fix one symptom, hand the car back, and the cycle would begin again. What made it worse was the intermittent nature of the problem. Some owners went long periods without serious trouble. Others experienced multiple breakdowns within a single year. There was no predictable pattern. You could not know, when you set off on a Saturday morning, whether this would be the day it failed. That uncertainty, that erosion of confidence, was in many ways more damaging than the breakdowns themselves. Mechanics, who were not familiar with the Stag's specific engineering quirks, would address the obvious symptoms without solving the underlying issue. The timing chain, in particular, required precise tensioning and a sequence of steps that wasn't obvious even to experienced technicians. Get it wrong, and many did, and the engine's fate was sealed within months. Triumph's dealer network was not adequately prepared. This is documented. The training, the technical support, the parts availability, none of it was at the standard the car's price point demanded. And the men paying nearly £3,000 were not buying a budget vehicle. They were buying a Grand Tourer. They expected Grand Tourer service. Now, and here is where it becomes genuinely uncomfortable, the question of what Triumph knew and when they knew it. Internal engineering records, reviewed by automotive historians in subsequent decades, suggest that concerns about the cooling system and engine thermals were raised before production commenced. Not after the first complaints came in, before. Engineers within the program had flagged that the cooling capacity was marginal. That under sustained high-speed running in warm conditions, precisely the conditions a Grand Tourer would routinely face, the system was not robust enough. Those concerns did not stop the launch. The decision was made to proceed. The deadline existed. The investment had been made. The motor show commitments were in place. And so the Stag went into production with a known weakness, and thousands of buyers were handed the consequences without ever being told. If you want a parallel, think about any moment in your own professional life when you've watched an organization push something out the door, knowing it wasn't ready, knowing there was a problem, telling itself that it could be fixed later, that it probably wouldn't matter, that the complaints, if they came, could be managed. They always come, and they never get managed. By the mid-1970s, the Stag's reputation on the second-hand market had collapsed. Cars that had sold new for close to £3,000 were changing hands for fractions of that. The joke started. British mechanics had a phrase for it, the kind of phrase that gets repeated in garages and pub car parks until it becomes received wisdom, and received wisdom becomes the only story anyone remembers. If you want to subscribe to this channel, now is the moment. We go deep on stories like this one, the real history, the decisions nobody talks about, the lessons that still matter. Hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me, did you ever own a Stag, or know someone who did? What do you remember? And if this is hitting home, share it with a friend who appreciates real automotive history. Right, back to the story, and the part that even die-hard fans rarely know. Let's put the Stag in context. Because one of the cruelest aspects of this story is what was happening simultaneously in Stuttgart and Munich. In 1971, the same year the Stag launched, Mercedes-Benz was selling the R107 SL, a two-seat roadster with a properly developed V8 and a level of engineering rigor that would allow some of those cars to still be running without major mechanical drama 40 years later. The Mercedes SL was not dramatically faster than the Stag. It was not radically better looking by universal agreement. What it was fundamentally, unambiguously, was reliable. It did what it promised, every time, for a very long time. That gap, not in styling, not in performance, but in basic execution and follow-through, is what separated a car that became an enduring classic from a car that became a cautionary tale. The Fiat 124 Spider was another contemporary, less premium, more affordable, but engineered with the kind of attention to its core mechanical systems that meant owners could use them without anxiety. When reliability becomes a distinguishing feature rather than a baseline expectation, something has gone badly wrong in the manufacturing culture. And the Stag's problem was fundamentally a cultural one. British Leyland in the early 1970s was an organization under severe internal pressure. The conglomerate was burning money. Labor relations across multiple plants were deteriorating. Management was under political scrutiny. The environment was one of crisis management, not patient excellence. Nobody had the authority, the budget, or frankly the appetite to delay the Stag, fix the engine properly, and launch it when it was truly ready. So they launched it as it was, and the market found out the hard way. Production ran from 1971 to 1977. In that time, approximately 25,000 Stags were built. That number, for a car at that price point, reflects modest commercial success relative to expectations, but more significantly, it reflects a production run that was cut short. The original projections had been more ambitious. The reputation damage curtailed demand before the model could reach its natural commercial ceiling. British Leyland was nationalized by the British government in 1975. The political and financial pressures that followed made any serious investment in model development effectively impossible. The Stag was discontinued in 1977 without a successor. No replacement was planned. No evolution of the concept was pursued. The idea, the beautiful, genuinely promising idea, was simply allowed to end. And here is the final, almost unbearable irony that sits at the heart of this whole story. The Rover V8, the engine that British Leyland's internal politics prevented from ever going into a Stag, the engine that Triumph was told, in essence, was not available to them. That engine went on to power the Range Rover from 1970 through to 2004, 34 years. It powered Morgan sports cars, it powered TVR, it powered Land Rover Defenders. It became one of the most celebrated and enduring engines in British automotive history. It was already proven, it was already there. It was, in every meaningful sense, the right engine for the Stag. And the men making the decisions chose internal politics over engineering sense, and passed the cost of that choice directly on to every single person who handed over their money and drove a Stag home. That's not an accident, that's a decision. Someone made it, and nobody at the time was held to account for it. Now here is something that surprises almost everyone when they hear it for the first time. The Stag survived, not officially, not from the factory, but through the hands of the people who refused to give up on it. From the late 1970s onward, a community of dedicated owners and independent engineers began doing what British Leyland had been unwilling to do: fix the car properly. The most significant development was the engine conversion. If the Triumph the 58 was the problem, and it clearly was, then the solution was to remove it and fit something better. And what did many of them choose? The Rover V8, the same engine that had been kept away from the Stag by internal politics in the first place. Owners were effectively finishing the job that the factory should have started: installing the right engine, sorting the cooling, addressing the timing chain issues, and discovering that when those problems were corrected, the rest of the car, the chassis, the suspension, the bodywork, the gearbox was genuinely good, solid, worth saving. Marque specialists emerged. Clubs formed. The Triumph Stag Owners Club, established in 1976 while the car was still in production, became one of the most technically knowledgeable single-marque organizations in Britain. These were not passive enthusiasts. These were people who understood the car at an engineering level, who produced technical guidance, who could advise on exactly which components needed addressing and in what sequence. What they collectively accomplished is a kind of quiet redemption story. A story about people who looked at something that had been let down by the institution that created it, and decided that the idea itself was still worth fighting for. Today, a properly sorted Triumph Stag mechanically rebuilt, cooling system upgraded, timing chain replaced with modern components, or the engine swapped entirely, is a genuinely wonderful car to drive. The looks have aged brilliantly. The T-bar silhouette is still distinctive and striking. Values on well-maintained examples have recovered substantially. Stags in excellent condition now command prices that reflect genuine collector demand. The bones were good. They always were. The failure was never in the concept. The failure was in the execution, and behind the execution, in the decisions and the culture that produced those decisions. This is the part of the story I want you to sit with for a moment. Because the lesson here is not simply about automotive history. The lesson is about what happens to good ideas when they fall into the hands of organizations that prioritize internal politics over the product, that protect departmental interests over customer welfare, and that push things out the door before they're ready, rather than absorbing the short-term cost of doing it right. The Stag paid the price. The buyers paid the price. The mechanics, who didn't know what they were dealing with, paid the price. And British Leyland, the organization responsible, was nationalized, subsidized by taxpayers, and eventually broken apart over the following decade. The institutional cowardice that ran through its culture did not save it. It accelerated its collapse. Every man who's worked in a large organization for any length of time has seen some version of this. The product that shipped too early. The warning that was ignored. The political decision that overrode the technical one. It happens at every scale. The Stag just happened to make it visible, on British roads, at 70 miles an hour, with the temperature gauge climbing. So where does that leave us? The Triumph Stag lasted 6 years in production. In the decades since, it has generated more written analysis, more forensic debate, more genuine passion than most cars that sold 10 times the volume. That alone tells you something. You don't argue this intensely about something that was merely mediocre. You argue about it because the potential was real. Because the betrayal was real. Because the gap between what it was and what it could have been is genuinely painful to contemplate. For the men who owned them in the 1970s, who made serious financial sacrifices to buy something they believed in and were then repeatedly let down, the emotions are complicated. Many of them still love the car, not because they've forgotten the breakdowns, but because they understood, somewhere in their gut, that the car itself wasn't the villain. They were betrayed by a system, not by the machine. That distinction matters more than it might seem. We live in an era now where the Stag's story is well documented. The mistakes are understood. The responsible parties, British Leyland's management structure, the internal politics that blocked the Rover V8, the decision to launch before the engineering was resolved, are part of the historical record. Nobody is hiding it anymore. It's just history. But history, to be worth anything, has to be learned from. And the core lesson of the Triumph Stag is simple enough to state, though apparently difficult enough that organizations keep failing to act on it. A great product idea is not enough. The execution has to match the ambition. The culture has to support the engineering. And the people at the decision-making level have to be willing to absorb the short-term cost of getting it right, rather than passing that cost downstream to the people who trusted them. The Stag was beautiful. It was genuinely original. In the right hands, with the right engine, it was, and is, a remarkable driving experience. It deserved better than it got, and the men who bought them, who saved up and signed the papers, and drove home, feeling like they'd finally got something right, they deserved better too. That's the Triumph Stag, the British GT that carried greatness in its bones and had it stripped away by the people who were supposed to protect it. If this kind of story matters to you, real history, real decisions, real consequences, then subscribe to this channel. We don't do surface level here. Leave a comment below. What does the Stag story remind you of? A car, a moment in your career, something you watched go wrong that didn't have to. Drop it below. The best conversations on this channel happen in the comments. Give this video a like if you got something from it. Share it with someone who appreciates proper history, not the sanitized version, but the real one. And we'll see you in the next one.